It's a different skill set to be on civilian law enforcement duty as compared to being on combat duty. So those skills are degraded and will have to be retrained. So there's that additional loss to our defense capabilities.
Hi, and welcome to Superpowers, the future of global security here on Times Radio. This week I am joined by Major General William Enyart, who was previously the Adjutant General of the Illinois National Guard, commanding both the Air and Army National Guard from 2007 to 2012. So a busy man, but General, welcome to Superpowers, and a fantastic person to have here, because I was only in DC a few weeks ago and was struck when I was crossing DuPont Circle to see men and women of the National Guard patrolling the streets. And as someone who was previously responsible for the UK armed forces from a political perspective and often was asked to deploy them in support of the civil powers, I was always acutely aware of the sort of risks in doing so, both reputationally and also, is it what we hold armies to do? I just wonder what you, as a former senior officer in the National Guard, make of these deployments.
Oh, good morning, James. I think it is a misuse of the National Guard. The National Guard here in the States really has two roles. The first is to act as a military reserve for both the Army and the Air, respectively. And the second role is to serve as a trained and ready force for the governors of the various states to use in the event of a calamity that is beyond the ability of local authorities to handle. Primarily in that role, we respond to hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and that sort of natural disaster, firefighting. And occasionally we will respond to civil disturbances. For example, some of the riots that have followed killings of black men in cities, where there has been civil disturbances, we will respond to those at the call of the governor. But it is at the call of the governor, not at the call of the president, almost exclusively.
And to what degree is that nuance understood and supported by the American public? Because again, like you, I was always struck by the responsibility to protect the institution of the British Armed Forces when I was being asked to deploy them maybe into the English Channel to repel illegal migrants, in a way that would have been hugely risky in terms of probability of Royal Marines being involved in the death of migrants by ships, by boats being bounced. And I felt acutely that it was my job to protect them as an institution from others in government. But the public were incredibly supportive of the Royal Marines and the Royal Navy being used in exactly that role to protect our borders. And so I just wonder whether you and I see this differently from the man and woman on the street in the average American city.
Well, I suspect that we do. We understand the role of the institution. We understand the limitations of that institution. And frankly, I think you and I are each each institutionalists, in that we value those institutions and understand their value to society. The person in the street, in all likelihood, doesn't have the nature and extent of the knowledge that we have regarding the limitations of those institutions and how they can be very damaged. I'm old enough to have lived through the 1960s and 70s. Where, for example, here in the States, we had the draft riots going on over draftees serving in Vietnam. And the National Guard in 1970 was called out to deal with student demonstrations in Ohio, and there were several students at Kent State University killed. I'm sure that's probably not a topic that your listeners are familiar with, but it still echoes in my generation. And the National Guard suffered a tremendous loss of reputation as a result of those killings. And it took us a generation or more to recover from that stain on our reputation. Today, the National Guard in the United States is held in incredibly high regard for a couple of reasons. Number one, because of the role that we have played in the long-term wars in the Middle East and in Afghanistan. At one point during the Iraq War, the National Guard provided more than half of the U.S. Army's combat power in Iraq. So that was a tremendous accomplishment for a reserve part-time military force. Then additionally, the role that we have played, or roles that we have played in rescuing citizens and assisting citizens in hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, firefighting, all of those civil disaster missions that we have undertaken has really bolstered our presence in the United States, our standing among the citizenry. And maybe that's one of the reasons that they think the National Guard can come to the rescue here. But civil law enforcement is not what we do. We're not trained to do it. It is not a role that we should be undertaking. You know, just as the UK has, and really our legal system is based on yours and the history and the tradition, and that is that the military does not enforce civil law. The military defends against foreign invasion. By and large. And when you get the military dabbling in civil law enforcement or being pushed into civil law enforcement, it's not a role that we're comfortable playing and that citizens should not be comfortable with us playing.
And that is an important distinction. You know, I think that, you know, even people who would say there's an imperative for the nation's armed forces, irrespective of the constitutional niceties of whether they belong to the governor or the president, you know, the nation's armed forces should be brought to bear against whatever the national political challenge of the day is, and in this case, you know, irregular migration on both sides of the Atlantic is very important. Militaries are trained to use lethal force, and they are trained to use overwhelming violence, because it is in that immediate application of overwhelming violence that you win the firefight. It's not a proportionate escalation that police forces are trained to use. And I genuinely worry, irrespective of the sort of institutional responsibility, there is just a straight up contradiction between the way that you train for war versus the way that you apply civil laws. And I would have thought, given the threat, the priority is preparing the American armed forces for war.
Well, you're absolutely correct there, and that's one of the points that I try to make every time I'm speaking out on this issue. And you know, the Trump administration has given two different reasons for wanting to bring the National Guard to bear. The first is that crime is raging out of control, that Chicago or Washington, D.C., wherever, is a hellhole, and we've got to have military forces in there to prevent crime. Then the second rationale is, well, we need the military to protect the Border Patrol agents and to protect federal property from these demonstrators who are, again, raging out of control and interfering with the federal government and destroying federal property. The courts so far have found that neither of those is true. And in fact, the statistics bear that out. While crime is a problem here in the States, as it is in any nation, that crime actually, the statistics have shown that crime has decreased in the last several years, particularly violent crime. And in terms of controlling demonstrators at federal buildings, those particularly dealing with border control and immigration control, the governor here of Illinois, I'm very familiar with the situation in Illinois, and I've met with the governor as well as with the director of state police about these issues, and they assure me and the public that, in fact, the situation is well under control. And the Illinois State Police has a significant presence there, and they're protecting not just the ICE agents, that is the immigration control agents, but they're also protecting the demonstrators from the out-of-control response of the federal agents. And federal judges in Chicago have found that these immigration control agents have used unlawful force against peaceful demonstrators. and the federal district judge there has ordered the agent and the supervising person in charge of those agents to appear in her courtroom every day to explain why he is misusing force against peaceful demonstrators. So clearly, Trump's claims that the military must be brought in to deal with these out-of-control situations is a false premise.
Yes, and General, it would be remiss of me, because I've said this to so many friends and colleagues since I got back from DC a couple of weeks ago, but I accept that this is the anecdotal experience of just one person, of just one place in your great country. But when I was staying in DC at the same hotel just off DuPont Circle 7 months ago, that roundabout was stank of drugs, had real menace, and felt genuinely sort of incongruous to the fact that it was right in the downtown of the American capital city, a stone's throw from the White House. When I was back 3 or 4 weeks ago, all of the smell of the drugs had gone, and there were people sat out playing chess, and it was chalk and cheese. Now that is the anecdotal experience of just one visitor, but the challenge is that all over your country, if that experience is being replicated, your point about the data that the police chief offered you notwithstanding, people will draw a conclusion that this is a very helpful use of the military and it's been successful.
Well, the problem is that this is a Band-Aid. It is not a solution. The military, to call up the National Guard and send them in to enforce civilian law is, as you have pointed out, a misuse of military force. We are trained in combat operations, and to a lesser extent, we're trained to respond to natural disasters, but we are not trained to deal with the niceties of civilian law enforcement. It's incredibly expensive. The number that I heard for 4,000 guardsmen in Los Angeles for 60 days was $120 million. Now, my question is, how many police officers could have been hired, trained, and sent into the field to respond to these for $120 million? So it is it's not just the cost to the taxpayer for deploying the Guard, but all too often, what is overlooked here is the cost to the guardsmen and their families and employers. Here in the States, almost all guardsmen are part-timers. They're part-time soldiers. They have jobs, they have schooling, they have families, all of which must be attended to. And, my experience in D.C. was a little bit different than yours. I was in D.C. 3 or 4 weeks ago where I testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee about these issues. And in driving around town, I saw exactly 4 National Guardsmen out sauntering along the street. I didn't see any crime. I didn't see any problems. And one of the visuals that we've had here so much in the States is the video of National Guardsmen loitering in front of the Washington Monument, having their photograph taken, spreading compost on flower beds, and picking up litter. Now, if you are a spouse of a National Guardsman who's been taken out of your family, who's not there to get the kids to school, to help you get the meals on the table and get the lawn taken care of, what are you thinking about your guardsman who is off shoveling compost onto a flower bed? If you're an employer, and here in the States, employers are required to hold the job for their guardsman employee. So while that guardsman is deployed, they have to either hire someone else temporary to come in and fill that position, or they have to spread that workload among other employees, or the work simply doesn't get done. In any event, if you're the employer who is watching your guardsmen shoveling compost, you cannot fire someone for being in the National Guard. You can't terminate their employment. But the next time you're getting ready to hire someone to fill a vacancy, are you going to hire a guardsman to fill that job? I think not. And as for those, a lot of young people are in the National Guard. A lot of our soldiers are young people getting an education because we have tremendous educational benefits for folks in the Guard. Many states pay their tuition at state universities, and they get a GI Bill stipend to help them get an education. So if you're called away for 30 days or 60 days, you're not just missing 30 or 60 days of school, you're probably missing an entire semester perhaps even an entire year of schooling. And if you're shoveling compost or picking up cigarette butts as your duty, you're not fighting a forest fire, you're not rescuing your citizens from flooding, what do you think about whether you'll re-enlist in the Guard or not? So those are all costs that are suffered.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a series of really good points there, and the side of it that is so often forgotten. I think a lot of people think that the armed forces are there at readiness to react to the nation's need, and of course that they are. But when the nation calls on them to be used, it imposes real cost and challenge to their wider family and on their careers if they are reservists or National Guardsmen. It's a point that is too often forgotten, and you make it very well indeed. Of course, they will be torn between a sense of duty to react to the needs of the nation, even if they disagree with the politics behind it, versus voting with their feet. But is there evidence yet that people are starting to vote with their feet and people are choosing not to re-enlist?
Well, it's too early to tell yet, but we have had guardsmen here in Illinois say they will not deploy if mobilized, and that's a very risky thing for someone in the military to say. So there is certainly some anecdotal evidence of that. Another point that I neglected to make, and that is, and you alluded to it, and that is that when these guardsmen are in cities doing jobs they're not trained to do, they are not being trained to do the jobs they're supposed to be doing. So we suffer a loss of readiness. As you pointed out, it's a different skill set to be on civilian law enforcement duty as compared to being on combat duty. So those skills are degraded and will have to be retrained. So there's that additional loss to our defense capabilities.
A key point, and no matter how well visits to Beijing go, and in time if Budapest is rearranged, the reality is that we are in a period of geopolitical uncertainty and real sort of threat that hasn't existed for generations. And the idea that militaries on either side of the Atlantic are being diverted towards support to the civil powers simply to meet a political imperative rather than training for the war fighting that they may sadly be called upon to do within the next 5 years or so, I find extraordinary. But as I've said, I genuinely worry that we are in a tiny minority in seeing it that way, General.
Well, I'm afraid you're right. And you're, of course, correct in saying that we live in an increasingly dangerous geopolitical environment. We went from essentially a bipolar world after World War II, where it was the Soviet Union and its allies against the United States and NATO, to a unipolar world where the U.S. was the leading power, to then a situation where we have China as a rising power, and now it's increasingly a multipolar world with as I indicated before, Europe as a power, Russia a fading power, but nonetheless with nuclear weapons, China, India, and the United States. So with the more possible combinations of adversaries, it is an increasingly fraught political and military situation. And one other point I'd like to make, and that is that here in the States, we've had a long tradition that the military does not get involved in politics, that the military stands apart from, and that's one of the reasons this military is held in such high regard here in the States. And with Trump increasingly dragging the military into use as political pawns for his theater, we see, I'm afraid, a degradation in that long-standing tradition of the military being separate and apart from politics.
Yeah, I agree. It is a worrying development, and that the moral components for fighting power that makes men and women take potentially fatal risk on the battlefield in service of their friends, their unit, their country. relies on this absolute belief in the sort of in the politicians that decided to send them having nothing but the best interest of the nation at heart. And the moment that they start to question whether there is politics in their orders is the moment that orders become debatable, and that is just so dangerous.
Yes. You know, it's I'm in the process of reading Paul Harris's brilliant trilogy on the life of Cicero, and I'm about to complete the second volume of that, Lustrum, and this is at that point in Cicero's life where Caesar is becoming the dictator, and he's taking control of the Senate, and he has his legions, and as I read that, I'm struck by the thought, my God, this could be the Washington Post that I'm reading here. The similarities between what happened in Rome more than 2,000 years ago and what's going on here today in terms of the politics is phenomenal. And of course, that trilogy was written well before we got to this stage of politics here in the States.
So I get differing opinions shared with me by friends in the US military about Pete Hegseth. Those who work in the DoD, I think, are slightly despairing and say that, the Department for War, say that the department is in a state of pretty low morale and pretty low confidence in the sort of efficacy and thoughtfulness of decision making. But others, I've got to say, out in the field force, think that he's a soldier and that he's got the interest of the average man and woman in uniform at heart. And they tell me that when he visits units, he's got a really good manner and a way of connecting with the troops that is important to them, makes them feel valued. I think I know what your view will be, but can you? How do you square that? I mean, I suppose you can be both things. You can be a poor strategic leader, but a fantastic empathizer with the private soldier on the front line.
Well, absolutely. Let's look at Secretary Hegseth's background. He has zero qualifications for this, or as close to zero as you can get, qualifications for this position, and but he was a network television personality, and he's got way too much hair gel, and is simply, as far as I'm concerned, an empty suit. He may be able to relate to, and that remains to be proven, but he may be able to relate to the soldier in the field. And when I was the general, one of the things I used to do was go run with the troops, and I would walk back into my headquarters after going for a 5-mile run around Camp Lincoln and dripping sweat on the desks of fat colonels. And I did that for a reason, to get a message across.
Yep.
But that can't be your only skill set. You have to be able to handle large bureaucracies. You have to be able to handle the complexities of international affairs. And if the qualification to become a Secretary of Defense is that you were a major in the National Guard and you picked up a Bronze Star in Iraq, I've got 10,000 majors who have better qualifications than Pete Hegseth. Not as good a hair, probably, and not as expensive a suits, but better qualifications.
To our point a minute ago about the risks of politicizing the armed forces and the strategic headquarters of the armed forces in the DoD, what are your reflections on the way that the Department for War, the Pentagon press operation is now working, and not all journalists, not all outlets are being treated equally? That feels quite dangerous to me.
Well, the Pentagon has long sought to control information, and you can go back to the Vietnam War and the release of the infamous release of the Pentagon Papers, the study that was performed on Vietnam and then subsequently leaked to the New York Times. So this, while it's nothing new for the Pentagon, the reach of the attempt here to control what goes in and out of the Pentagon is unheard of. The Pentagon at least paid lip service to the American Constitution's First Amendment, freedom of the press. But today there's not even a semblance of that. The Pentagon believes that the media should simply be or perhaps not all of the Pentagon, but certainly Hegseth and his cronies believe that the Pentagon should simply be a mouthpiece for the Trump administration. And the press corps, good for them, refuses to do that. I think we have two institutions here in this country that absolutely are our last line of defense, and that is the press corps and the courts. So far, the trial courts, the federal trial courts, have stood up to Trump, with the intermediate appellate courts doing so also. Now we'll see whether the Supreme Court does or not. But I'm appalled at what Hegseth is trying to do with the press corps. And of course, this echoes what they have done with the senior ranks of the military. They fired all of the top lawyers in the military. I was speaking this morning with a recently retired Judge Advocate General Corps officer who was very senior, held a general officer rank, and the administration doesn't want anyone who is going to voice any objections to their goals. Clearly what's going on in the Caribbean, what's going on with sinking these alleged drug boats. Violation of law of war, violation of international law, violation of U.S. law, but all of the top JAGs are gone. And now Hegseth has announced that he wants to detail, that is, send out JAGs, as the lawyers are known, out of the Pentagon, out of the military, and put them on the border to deal with border crossings. That's not a proper use of a military lawyer.
No, I agree. And it goes again to that point about the moral components of fighting power and the trust that troops have to have in the legality of orders, because the risks that they take on the back of those orders are mortal. And they have to believe unquestioningly that what they're being asked to do is thought through and legal. Very, very worrying. General, when I as a British Defence Minister, if I visited Indo-PACOM, CENTCOM or EUCOM, I was always very, very clear that we were the junior partners and that the Americans were 100 times more committed in that theatre. The one place I could go and feel like I was equally committed to the theatre was to your Southern Command in Miami, where our frigate in the Caribbean was about the equal of the kind of the Coast Guard cutters that the US had there. Not so. I think Southern Command are on their way to being kind of the war fighting headquarters, while CENTCOM, Indo-PACOM and EUCOM hold their beer. Is this real? Are we actually going to see the US at war with Venezuela?
Well, I'm very, very concerned about what's going on with Venezuela, and of course, the reason that for this military buildup and the reason for the sinkings of these speedboats has far less to do with drugs than it has to do with oil. If Donald Trump proceeds with the sanctions against the secondary sanctions against Russian oil, as he's promised to do, although we all know Trump is infamous for saying he's going to do something and then backing down. That's why here in this country, Trump is sometimes referred to as taco. That is, Trump always chickens out. Should he proceed with these secondary oil sanctions, that is going to force China and India to go into the world market and buy oil. What happens then? The price of oil is going to skyrocket. One thing that every American president over the last dozen or so have learned is that you don't mess with the price of gasoline in the United States. That will get you into deep hot water with voters quicker than anything else. So Trump absolutely must keep the price of oil down. How do you do that? You can do that by seizing Venezuelan oil. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, like something on the order of 4 times that of the U.S., which is now the world's largest oil exporter. So what do we do? Well, and by the way, Venezuela today exports less oil than it did 30 years ago. They produce less oil. Why? Because of corruption, because of U.S. oil embargoes, and the Venezuelan oil fields simply can't produce. Who are the greatest oil production engineers in the world? Who are the greatest folks at being able to bring back old oil fields? The U.S. We've done that. The U.S. today is the world's largest oil exporter. So that's the reason for this pressure on Venezuela. It has little to do with drugs. Had it to do with drugs, then, as you point out, it would be the U.S. Coast Guard. It would be aided by the Brits, our DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency, and other counter-narcotics law enforcement would be doing this. So this is simply a plan on the part of the Trump administration to ensure that U.S. companies can get that oil, produce that oil, and keep world oil prices down.
So, and is it, ignore the legitimacy of whether that should or shouldn't be the policy of the United States, but could this cause Maduro to fall? Is this a workable plan?
Well, Maduro, Venezuela certainly doesn't have a military that can begin to compete with the U.S. There are sources today that are saying we're going to strike within Venezuela within hours, if not within days, if not hours. I anticipate that the U.S. could overwhelm Venezuela in short order. And, in fact, let's look at the military forces that are being moved into the region. If we were actually going after drug boats, you don't use the world's largest aircraft carrier to do that. You use cutters and smaller aircraft and boats like the Coast Guard possesses to go after drug couriers. Now, this is the beginnings of a major military move. I suspect that the hope is that Maduro will cave when he's faced with this overwhelming military power. But I think in order to do so, he'll have to be offered something to leave Venezuela. Dictators don't do well when they're forced out of power as a general rule.
I wonder when the last time Southern Command had an operational carrier group in their region. I mean, it is an extraordinary statement of intent from the United States to be, this is the sort of capability that you think of as being in the Sea of Japan or in the Persian Gulf, or in the sort of North Atlantic looking for the Russians. This is a war-fighting capability, America's premier war-fighting capability, now in the Caribbean, parked off the north coast of Venezuela. It is extraordinary.
It is. It absolutely is. And what that has done is it has pulled that carrier group out of the Mediterranean, out of a sea where they can quickly respond to problems with Russia, to problems in the Middle East. And that, to me, is a huge misuse, a huge waste of military power. Do we really need a carrier battle group in the Mediterranean? Who's going to challenge us there? It's certainly not going to be Cuba or Venezuela or China for that, or Russia for that matter. They don't have the capabilities to put a significant force there. So this is using military resources that are really far more useful in other places, whether it be the South China Sea or the Sea of Japan to counterbalance China or North Korea, or in the Mediterranean to counterbalance forces that might create a problem in whether it be Iran or Russia. This is not a wise use of military forces.
Well, whilst they're in the region, though, and I was wound up very effectively by some US military strategists who were talking about the growing Russian and Chinese presence in the Western Caribbean and how that could very conceivably create an anti-access area denial challenge to the United States into the eastern entrance to the Panama Canal. And they were concerned about that, when it comes to reinforcing the Pacific Fleet from the Atlantic, when it becomes to the US interest around trade in the region, that growing Russian and Chinese presence in the Western Caribbean made sense as a strategic threat to the US. And so, all of a sudden, the US, I take your point about the capability being lost from the Mediterranean, where arguably the Russian and Iranian threat is more pressing. But the US investing in its near abroad and securing its sphere and its sea lines of communication is a strategically sound thing to do, even if I'm not sure that's necessarily what's in Hegseth or Trump's thinking.
Well, certainly we want to prevent the Chinese from gaining a foothold in the Caribbean, whether it be Venezuela or Cuba or elsewhere. But at this point, certainly there is no military capability in that region that can in any way challenge our overwhelming ability to project force there. So any claim that this carrier battle group is going there to counterbalance the Chinese is so far overblown that it's risk being ridiculed.
Fair enough. General, I've really enjoyed our conversation. All power to your elbow in making the point that you do about the need to respect the institution of the military. As I've said 3 or 4 times, and we're in violent agreement, I understand why using the military is popular to deal with something like migration, but these reputations are built over centuries, and they can be gone in a single night of a young soldier getting it wrong. And then there is, as you so rightly say, the opportunity cost that is, to their careers, to their families, and to their willingness to serve on. So good luck to you as you continue to make that case.
Mr. Minister, it's been a pleasure being with you today, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. Your conversation is and your questions are far more piercing than, unfortunately, I receive on most American media outlets.
Well, you see, that's because I'm not a very good journalist, but I was once a practitioner. So there we go.
I can tell that.
General, thank you so much. You've been watching Superpowers, the future of global security here on Times Radio. For more of Times Radio's brilliant geopolitical content, make sure that you subscribe to the YouTube channel. But for now, thank you to my guest this week, Major General William Enyart, former Adjutant General of the Illinois National Guard. I'm James Heappey, and I'll see you next week.